To the watching public, one royal walking behind another might seem meaningless. Inside the palace, however, that position carried a much sharper message. Zara was not merely being asked to follow Camilla. She was being pushed to publicly recognize a new family order that had never been privately accepted. Royal processions were never arranged by accident. Every step, pause, and carefully measured space between relatives said something. Whoever walked first displayed authority, while whoever followed appeared to accept it. The public saw tradition, but palace insiders understood that a procession was a moving declaration of power. Since Charles became king, Camilla's position had been strengthened repeatedly. Her title alone was no longer enough. Palace officials wanted her authority to look visible, solid, and impossible to challenge. Ceremonies increasingly placed her at the center of the family, surrounded by royals whose presence created the appearance of support. Each arrangement looked formal, yet together they delivered a bold message. Camilla was no longer simply Charles' wife. She was the woman everyone else was expected to stand behind. Zara had never openly challenged her position. She remained polite, controlled, and careful not to spark a public family scandal. Still, there were gestures Zara quietly avoided. She would not fake warmth simply because protocol demanded it, and she resisted displays that could look like personal submission. That instinct came partly from Princess Anne, who believed respect should be earned through service, discipline, and sacrifice, not handed over automatically because of marriage or a new title. Zara also remembered how Queen Elizabeth handled painful family divisions. The late queen understood that forced unity often created deeper resentment. She protected the institution, but rarely demanded that relatives pretend their private wounds had vanished. When distance prevented further damage, she allowed that distance to remain. That careful balance was now gone. The procession placed Zara directly behind Camilla and ahead of another senior royal. The position was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Someone had chosen it knowing exactly how the photographs would look across newspapers and social media. Zara's presence could be sold as proof that Anne's branch had accepted Camilla's authority without question. Some courtiers believed the image would strengthen Charles and shut down rumors of tension. Zara suspected something more personal. After earlier disagreements over ceremonial decisions and family roles, the placement felt like a test. If she obeyed, the palace could use that photograph forever. If she refused, she could be blamed for threatening royal unity before a major event. Outwardly, Zara remained calm, but the meaning of that single step became heavier by the second. Then Charles entered the corridor, ordered the aides to leave, and stood alone with her. Once the door closed, he made one thing clear. This was no longer about protocol. It was about whether Zara would obey him in front of the entire monarchy. Charles did not arrive shouting, and that made the confrontation even more dangerous. Speaking softly, he reminded Zara that the family was minutes away from facing the world. Then came the warning. One act of resistance could weaken Camilla's position and embarrass the crown. His voice stayed controlled, but every word landed like a command. There was no time for a family argument, he told her. The doors would soon open, and millions would examine every movement. Duty required discipline, and whatever Zara felt had to remain private until the ceremony ended. To Charles, her refusal was not some minor discomfort. One pause, misplaced step, or nervous glance could be captured and replayed endlessly. Commentators would hunt for conflict, and headlines would scream about division. One woman refusing a position could quickly become a public judgment on Camilla and on the stability of Charles's reign. Charles insisted the order had been approved for institutional reasons. It was not intended to insult Zara, diminish Anne, or humiliate anyone. The arrangement, he claimed, simply met the ceremony's needs. Zara listened without interrupting before asking the question he had clearly hoped to dodge. If the position meant nothing, why had nobody consulted her before assigning it? The silence that followed exposed more than his explanation ever could. Charles knew Camilla would not view Zara's refusal as a technical objection. She would see it as another rejection from a family that had never completely welcomed her. For years, Charles had watched every hesitation around Camilla become another personal wound. As king, he had privately promised her that the family would stand visibly united behind her during major ceremonies. Zara refused to carry that burden. Camilla's insecurity, she argued, could not become everybody else's responsibility. The family still carried old pain, broken trust, and memories that had never been settled. A carefully staged procession might hide those wounds, but it could never erase them. Charles then invoked Queen Elizabeth, reminding Zara that his mother had placed duty above personal feelings for decades. He argued that the crown survived because people sometimes accepted positions they had not chosen. Zara's response struck harder than open defiance. Would the late queen truly have forced a relative into a public display of loyalty that had never existed in private? Charles's expression shifted when Zara mentioned an understanding between Queen Elizabeth and Princess Anne. That agreement had been private, delicate, and never meant to influence a ceremony. Yet Zara spoke as if she knew precisely what had been promised. Charles immediately asked whether Anne had encouraged her refusal. The question revealed his real fear. This might not be Zara acting alone, but the first sign of resistance from Anne's entire branch. Zara denied that her mother had instructed her. After a long pause, however, she revealed something far more troubling. Anne had warned her that one day the palace might ask her to confuse obedience with acceptance. That warning led back to a private conversation after the Queen's death, and an agreement Charles believed had never left the room. In the days after Queen Elizabeth's funeral, grief temporarily silenced the family's rivalries. Behind closed doors, Anne demanded one assurance from her brother. Camilla's elevation would not come at the expense of the Queen's children. Charles agreed, but this procession suggested that his promise had quietly vanished. Those days were filled with sorrow, yet the machinery of succession was already moving. Titles were confirmed, residences reviewed, and ceremonial responsibilities reassigned. Even Queen Elizabeth's jewels entered a new and uncertain chapter. Nothing remained untouched because every symbol connected to the late Queen now carried power in Charles's reign. Anne understood those stakes better than most. She did not challenge Camilla's title or deny Charles the right to shape his monarchy. Her concern was more personal and potentially more explosive. She wanted to know whether the Queen's children would be expected to step aside emotionally as well as ceremonially. Would their family position be reduced simply to make Camilla appear stronger? In private, Anne pressed Charles for a direct answer. She separated constitutional respect from personal submission. Camilla could be queen, and the family could honor that role, but nobody should be used in staged moments that made private loyalty look deeper than it truly was. Charles gave Anne the assurance she wanted. He promised that no relative would be deliberately used to create images of surrender. No procession, entrance, or public arrangement would make one branch appear beneath another purely for appearances. Zara later learned about that promise, not as casual gossip, but as a serious warning. Anne told her because royal promises were often strongest when first spoken, and weakest once circumstances changed. A promise made during grief could later be rewritten by advisors, ceremony planners, and the pressures of a new reign. That was why the procession mattered. Who entered first, who escorted whom, and who walked behind another were never harmless details. Those choices formed a language of inheritance. They told the public who represented continuity, who held authority, and who had accepted the new order. Yet another issue was even more sensitive than the procession. After Charles' accession, several jewels closely associated with Queen Elizabeth had been placed under Camilla's control, and that opened an entirely new royal battle. Some jewels belonged to the crown, while others carried deeply personal family meaning. One piece long expected to remain connected to Anne's branch had quietly been reserved for Camilla's future use. When Zara learned this, the procession felt like part of something much bigger. It was no longer simply about where she stood. The arrangement appeared to be another step in presenting Camilla as the monarchy's central female authority, even where family memories remained unsettled. Zara told Charles that the order violated more than her dignity. It broke the assurance he had given Anne while the family was grieving. Charles replied that circumstances had changed. Becoming king had placed new responsibilities on him, and old promises could not always survive the crown's demands. Zara held his gaze and asked the question he had not expected. Had that same excuse been used to redirect the Queen's jewels? Charles' concern immediately turned to alarm. Zara had touched the one subject the palace wanted kept far away from the procession. The confrontation was never only about Zara's position. Beneath it sat a jewel connected to Queen Elizabeth, a piece Anne believed would remain within her family line. When it appeared on a private palace inventory under Camilla's authority, the procession suddenly became impossible to dismiss as harmless protocol. It was not one of the grand crown jewels displayed at state occasions. This piece was far more intimate. The finely crafted brooch, set with pale stones and carrying decades of private history, had belonged to Queen Elizabeth's personal collection. Its value went far beyond rarity or craftsmanship. The brooch belonged to family memory. Anne had long expected it to remain close to her branch. Nothing had been formally promised in public, but the private understanding was that Zara, and perhaps one day Mia, might wear it. For them, it would never be just an ornament. It would provide a direct connection to the woman who had held the family together for generations. After Charles' accession, however, the brooch was quietly transferred into a restricted royal collection. Access was controlled by the sovereign, while requests passed through Camilla's wardrobe office. There was no announcement and no explanation. That silence protected the palace from awkward questions about whether the brooch was private property, inherited property, or an object being absorbed into the authority of the new reign. Zara discovered the change almost by accident when a longtime dresser who had served Queen Elizabeth mentioned that the brooch was no longer stored where it had once been. The employee accused nobody of wrongdoing. She simply warned Zara that the piece had been moved and marked for possible future use. That detail hit Zara hard. Queen Elizabeth had worn the brooch during a private family milestone involving her, a moment remembered not by the public but by those who had shared it. To Zara, the piece represented affection, approval, and a memory untouched by palace politics. Camilla might never have requested it personally, but her staff understood the power of royal symbolism. If she wore something strongly associated with Elizabeth, it would create a striking image of continuity. The old reign would appear to flow naturally into the new one. Suddenly, Zara saw the brooch and the procession as pieces of the same campaign. Camilla would stand at the center while Queen Elizabeth's granddaughter walked behind her. Later, Camilla might appear wearing a jewel tied to Zara's private family memories. The message would be unmistakable. Authority, history, and inheritance now passed through Camilla. Charles denied that the ceremony had anything to do with the brooch. Yet when Zara asked him to promise that Camilla would never wear it, he refused. Zara's next question sliced through his polished explanation. Was the family now expected to surrender both its position and its memories to protect the new reign? Charles did not respond. His silence exposed another fear. Anne might possess letters, notes, or private records showing that the brooch had been intended for her family. Before Zara could press further, an official interrupted. Camilla had noticed the delay and wanted to know why the procession had not started. Camilla was already heading toward the corridor, while the opening music was only moments away. Charles had seconds to prevent a private rebellion from becoming a royal spectacle. He made a decision that would never appear in the official record. He personally changed the procession and moved Zara away from the disputed position. Saving the ceremony, however, meant someone else had to absorb the embarrassment, and Charles knew exactly who it would be. His manner changed instantly. A moment earlier, he had been a father, brother, and husband caught inside an old family wound. Now, he became the king, and emotion disappeared behind cold calculation. The ceremony was seconds from beginning. There was no time to settle arguments about loyalty, inheritance, or broken promises. Charles could only stop the scandal from exploding. He demanded the printed procession order. An aide handed it over, expecting a final confirmation. Instead, Charles took a pen and changed the formation himself. Zara was moved beside another royal, close enough to maintain the appearance of unity, but far enough to avoid the image she had refused to create. The correction solved one problem and created another. Somebody had to take her original position. Charles selected a less senior relative whose loyalty was unlikely to be questioned, someone who would understand that refusing was not an option. The decision was swift and almost brutal. Zara's dignity would be protected by quietly sacrificing somebody else's position. Before anyone could object, Charles delivered the official explanation. The adjustment would be described as a logistical correction caused by limited space and timing. Nobody was to discuss the argument, mention the brooch, or suggest that Zara had refused anything. Zara understood exactly what he had done. Charles had given her an escape, but he had not accepted her argument. The deeper conflict remained untouched. Camilla's authority, Anne's warning, and the fate of Queen Elizabeth's brooch still hung heavily between them. This was not a resolution, it was a cover-up. Charles warned Zara that once the doors opened, she had to walk without hesitation. There could be no backward glance, visible anger, or suggestion that the order had changed under pressure. One careless movement could revive the crisis he had just buried. Camilla arrived moments later and immediately sensed that something was wrong. The voices sounded too careful, and one aide refused to meet her eyes. Worse, the amended sheet had not been hidden quickly enough. The crossed-out positions were still visible. Charles stepped forward before Camilla could inspect the document. He claimed the change had been made for security and movement reasons. By taking responsibility, he placed himself directly between Camilla and the truth. Her reaction remained perfectly controlled. Camilla accepted the explanation in front of the staff, but her private question was much sharper. Who had objected? Charles refused to answer. With the tension still hanging in the corridor, the procession finally began. Zara walked with total composure while Charles repeatedly checked the formation, searching for any sign that the last-minute alteration had been noticed. To the cameras, nothing appeared unusual. The royal family moved as one, exactly as the palace intended. But Princess Anne was not fooled by the polished public image. She studied the spacing and the relative now standing where Zara had originally been placed. Anne recognized the correction instantly. Charles had abandoned his own arrangement, and she knew there could be only one reason. The public saw a flawless royal procession, but Anne saw what her daughter had refused to do. The ceremony ended without an obvious scandal, yet Charles had only delayed the real reckoning. Away from the cameras, Anne approached him while holding the corrected procession sheet. She did not ask what had happened. She asked why Charles had placed Zara there after promising he never would. Anne had waited until every public duty was complete. She had smiled when required, followed the service, and protected the dignity of the crown. But now she was ready to challenge the betrayal behind closed doors. That was the difference between rebellion and loyalty. Anne would never embarrass the monarchy in public, but she would not allow silence to surrender. The paper in her hand came from a staff member who believed it would soon be destroyed. Beneath Charles' corrections, the original positions remained visible. Zara's name had been crossed out and moved. To Anne, that single mark proved everything. Her daughter had not misunderstood the order. Charles had changed it because he knew exactly what the original position implied. Charles defended himself using the language of duty. Camilla's ceremonial status had to be clear, and the household could not keep working around private sensitivities. If the family appeared uncertain about the queen, the palace would look divided. He insisted that his decision protected stability. Anne's reply was calm but fierce. Stability was not the same as forcing relatives to become symbols of Camilla's acceptance. Zara had been positioned so the public would see obedience and mistake it for affection. That was not unity. It was an image manufactured from somebody else's silence. Then Anne revealed that she knew about the disputed jewel. She had kept correspondence connected to Queen Elizabeth's intentions, including a personal note referring to the brooch and the family branch where it should remain. It was not a formal will and carried no clear legal command, but its emotional meaning was devastating. Queen Elizabeth's wishes appeared clear, even if palace lawyers could debate their legal strength. Charles's restraint began to crack. He accused Anne of using private family papers to challenge decisions made during his reign. He was king now, Charles reminded her. The collection, ceremonies, and public order of the family fell under his authority. Anne refused to back down. Authority could decide where an object was stored, but it could not erase memory, rewrite a promise, or turn family history into a tool for royal publicity. Charles asked whether Anne had encouraged Zara to refuse. Anne said no. Zara had acted alone, but she would not condemn her daughter for rejecting an arrangement designed to create a false impression. Zara had simply defended a boundary Charles had already promised to respect. Neither of them realized that Camilla had reached the doorway. She heard enough to understand that Zara had objected and that the jewel belonged to the same dispute. Camilla remained outside briefly, listening as the confrontation became less political and more painfully personal. When Camilla finally entered, her voice was calm, but her question carried years of hurt. Would this family ever consider her legitimate? The words stripped away every polished excuse. Titles, ceremonies, and carefully staged photographs had defended Camilla's position for years, but none could guarantee genuine acceptance. Anne answered with brutal honesty. She respected Camilla as queen and would perform every duty required of her. But respecting an official role did not mean surrendering family history to make Camilla feel secure. Memories could not be transferred like titles, and affection could not be ordered into existence. That distinction struck Camilla's deepest wound. She admitted that Diana's shadow still shaped how every gesture around her was interpreted. A distant expression became loyalty to the past. A formal greeting looked like hostility, and even silence felt like judgment. Camilla believed one missing smile could outweigh years of public service. Charles listened as both husband and king, trapped between two painful truths. He wanted to defend Camilla, yet he could no longer deny that he had tried to manufacture unity before earning the trust beneath it. He had arranged positions and demanded discipline, hoping that repeated public displays would eventually look like genuine acceptance. Zara then entered the conversation. She calmly explained that she had not rejected Camilla's title. She rejected the message created by walking directly behind her. The photographs would have been presented as personal approval rather than ceremonial respect, and once that image spread, its meaning could never be corrected. Charles finally offered a compromise. The disputed brooch would not be worn, loaned, or reassigned until its history and Queen Elizabeth's correspondence had been reviewed. Future procession orders involving sensitive positions would also be discussed before approval. No relative would again be pushed into a symbolic role without warning. Camilla accepted the terms, but she understood their real meaning. Zara's refusal had created a boundary that would shape future ceremonies. The palace quickly replaced the original procession documents, making the corrected version the official record. Since the cameras had captured nothing unusual, no public explanation was necessary. One copy, however, remained with Anne, proof of how close the ceremony had come to open royal defiance. Later, Charles watched the official footage. The family appeared calm, united, and perfectly arranged. Only he knew how much anger and pain had been hidden behind those measured steps. Then another request arrived. Camilla's office wanted the disputed brooch for an upcoming appearance. Charles now faced the test he had postponed: honor the compromise or expose it as an empty promise made only to silence the crisis. The public noticed nothing, and the monarchy protected its polished image. Behind palace doors, however, Zara's refusal had redrawn the limits of Camilla's power. The procession lasted only minutes, but the line Zara refused to join would divide the family long after the cameras were gone. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more royal drama, hidden tensions, and palace secrets.